And I'm not trying to shift anybody's religion. I don't think you are either. We're just trying to help them open their mind of having that personal revelation, of that personal understanding of, hey, sometimes there are things that are good for me that maybe the mass or an old thinking might not recognize, but they're not living in my shoes. They're not dealing with my aches and pains. They're not dealing with my digestive problems or my cancer or my this. What do I need, and where can I be comfortable in my own skin? Educating myself about something like cannabis and deciding for myself where and how much to use, and feel okay with that. Good morning. I am joined today with David Putvin. I just want to share a little bit about David. He's the author of Considering Cannabis. The subtitle of his book is The Mass Suffering of Humanity Depends on It, a book that reveals many aspects of cannabis that are often overlooked by not only consumers, but also lifelong industry professionals. His book is intended to help everyone understand the actual medical needs of cannabis in the world today. Criminalized, recreational, and medical markets are currently collecting substantial ongoing payments from hardworking consumers of the cannabis community. David believes that the focus of these three cannabis industries should become a united front. And the secret to the success of affordable access to cannabis lies possibly in home growing. So with us today is David Putvin. David, thank you for joining us today. So your book, how long has it been on Amazon?
So far, I've been really happy with what I've done with the book so far. I've kind of just put the book out there. I've marketed to like close people around me, but I've really been trying to make sure the book isn't missing anything before I continue to keep doing more with it. I didn't want to do an audiobook with it until I was confident that the book has covered everything that I want to cover, and also to make sure that I'm not saying anything that is just not going to be accepted by either the cannabis industry or maybe something that consumers aren't even going to agree with me on. But so far, I've had a lot of people around me read the book and give me really good positive feedback that I kind of have created something that is really good at explaining many aspects of cannabis that often go unmentioned by various professionals or longtime or new consumers of cannabis. There's just a lot to think about, and it's not as simple as going to the dispensary, picking up your weed, and then good luck. There's a little bit more to the story, and everybody's a little bit different, but there's a lot of different ways to recommend cannabis, and there's a lot of different ways to consume cannabis, and there's a lot to the pricing and the economy of it. So my book has a little bit of all of it.
Yeah, I think your book does a great job laying out all the things you just mentioned. And as you work on your flow with that, which I'm sure will fine tune as you start doing more presentations and speaking, because that's the beautiful part of a book, is it shows that you're authority in that area because you've taken the time to actually research and organize a book to help the public. So kudos for finishing the book, for one. And for two, I hope it leads to some speaking opportunities where you can really help share with the public from the heart, because I know you bring this from the heart, to really help people help themselves in an area that has just been in the shadows for far too long. Well, let me ask you this question from the book. What do you really mean when you're saying that the benefits of cannabis are for everyone? I mean, everyone's a pretty general term. So who's everyone, and how does cannabis benefit all of us?
Yeah, so in the book, I really wanted to make it very clear that the benefits are for everyone, because when I kind of envisioned writing the book, initially I was just writing it for the people of Utah. And so I was thinking that the religious populations in Utah wouldn't really see themselves as a candidate for cannabis. And before I released the book, I decided to kind of pull away from focusing on Utah and looking at more of the global perspective. And I was seeing that religious people don't always see cannabis as an option for them for various reasons. But I wanted to make a point that the benefits of cannabis are for everyone, and that they are good for humans and have things to offer to humans. And even people that kind of don't agree with the idea of cannabis because they don't want to experience psychoactive activity or be brought outside of their rooted self, is kind of sometimes how they might view it. But cannabis within cannabis, there's many different compounds, and some of those compounds are non-psychoactive. So there are cannabis compounds that people can be consuming, and they're not necessarily going to notice any mental effects with that. It's more of like that somebody could take CBG, for instance, and have benefits for their gastrointestinal issues, and somebody who doesn't have cannabis for that treatment is going to be facing an array of different alternatives that may have a list of side effects, where the CBG for cannabis is not going to have nearly the side effects as some of the other medications that are available.
You bring up two really good points. One is that with cannabis, there are not the side effects that a lot of the pharmaceutical drugs have, because once they've titrated something down and patented it, now there's such a strong active ingredient that your body can't metabolize it without side effects. So you get the effect and the side effect. But what you're pointing out is the CBD, though some people may have their religious issues, which we can dive in a little bit more later, of saying, oh, I don't want to take that because religiously I have some sort of hiccup against it, or I don't want to let go of the control of myself. You're saying there are parts that they can now titrate out, still in a natural form with CBD or whatever, get the cause that they want to help their digestive problems or their other ailments they may be suffering from toned down, which I do want to talk about a list of some of the benefits of cannabis. But their body's still able to metabolize it, which because it's still in a natural form. That's what's so amazing to me, is I've noticed over the decades that the laws, which are pushed by Big Pharma, suppress the use or make it illegal to use marijuana because it's a natural thing, much like an essential oil or an herb that you might cook with, that has such good health benefits that it threatens some of their products and the income from their products. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, just the idea of people getting cannabis into their house really does provide them a variety of different options that are competitive with various industries. It's not just the medical industry that could be affected. It could be like the food industry could be affected, because if people have cannabis fully integrated into their life, it's not just THC versus pain pills. It's also CBG versus gastrointestinal pills. It's also hemp seed is really high in protein and fats. So it would start to compete with the fish oil market. It could start competing with different proteins that are available. It's a better, more complete source of protein than soy. And it's better than pea proteins. And I still eat meat, but a lot of the like vegan community should really be looking at hemp over the soy proteins and pea proteins that are also popular.
That's good. I did not know that about the hemp, that it has such high concentration of proteins. And are they easily digestible proteins?
Yeah, so you can order them either just as like the whole, like a shelled whole, and so it's just kind of like the soft insides of the seed. You can get it like that, or you can get it in powder form, which is how I do it. And you can just mix like quarter cup of that into your protein shake. So it would basically just like replace an extra scoop in your protein shake. And
Awesome.
that will give you 6 grams of fat, and it's a better source of fat than fish oil. So it'd be like downing 6 fish oil capsules. And then you're also getting the benefit of the added protein from a plant source rather than an animal source, which some people like to kind of balance that out a little bit if they can.
Agreed. That's very cool. All right, David, we may have gone down this a little bit, but what's the difference between good advice and bad advice when it comes to suggesting cannabis over available alternatives?
So there's a couple layers to the question. Now, good advice and bad advice in the industry, I think there's a lot of ways that cannabis has been promoted to consumers in just kind of more of a, you have the right to this and you have the freedom to this. And that has been a very important part in getting access to cannabis to people in the world. But we're kind of past that now. That was more of like ensuring human rights. And I think that's kind of more recognized today. But it's basically what opened the door for the medical industry. It had to show that, it had to teach people that this isn't just a no. This isn't something that people can just say, like, this is definitely not good for you. Once medical markets started to come into play, it really started to make sense to more people that this is something that can be used against alternatives. And so when I say like good advice and bad advice that exists when it comes to cannabis, on the industry side, there's the promoting smoking versus promoting edibles versus promoting either a flower or a concentrate, which there's a few nuanced things with those, but it comes down to like, there's good ways to consume cannabis and then there's better ways to consume cannabis. So there's that element, but then there's also the element of, in life, everybody gets their cannabis advice from somewhere, from someone. It's usually a trusted person around them. It could be a parent, it could be a teacher, it could be just kind of society as a whole, depending on what country you live in. There's a lot of like possibility of like what makes somebody think what they think about cannabis. And when it comes to good advice and bad advice in cannabis, bad advice is to not recommend cannabis, which I will also refer to as non-cannabis advice. So non-cannabis advice, if you give that advice to everyone around you, you have now cut all of those people off from cannabis, and those people are now facing all of the alternatives that if you don't consume cannabis, you now have a list of things that you're facing or will face in your life. Because when you have something and you go needing a prescription, when you take cannabis off that list, you are facing a list of other options that, say you have a surgery, say you have a tooth pulled, or even just like start getting sick. Like you start to reach for things that are going to be reducing your pain, and there's things that are readily available, whether it's alcohol at a gas station or it's aspirins in the grocery store. Like all of these different things are worse alternatives than cannabis. Good advice and bad advice when it comes to cannabis. The bad advice would be to not give cannabis advice, and the good advice would just be to recommend cannabis as thoroughly as possible, so that when people are coming into cannabis, they're not just needing to guess what it is for them, and you can actually educate people before they even get into cannabis how to use cannabis effectively and to use it more safely than if they were to just say start loading up a bong and smoking a bong, where that has a lot of smoke inhalation compared to if you had like a vape pen with concentrated THC. The concentrated vape pen, one hit, that would be like a full dose for most people, especially like a starting dose, where a bong rip, like you got to load it, you got to clean it. There's a lot to deal with, but one rip off of that, you might have to do 5 bong rips to equal one quick pen hit.
How strong are the gummies comparative to those two options?
So gummies are another thing as far as avoiding inhalation. You can take gummies instead. The problem with gummies are For one, a lot of the gummies will have sugars and other food products that aren't pure cannabis. So sometimes that can become a problem where if you're integrating a regular consumption with cannabis, you might not want to be eating, like adding candy to your diet, essentially. But also the pricing of edibles. The pricing of edibles compared to like a concentrated pen are much higher. It's nice to have the pre-dosed amounts to where you're not having any inhalation and you can just grab a quick gummy and eat that. The problem is that when you start comparing your price per milligram to the price per milligram in either flour or the oils, it starts to, like, when you start looking at, say, regular use of 500 milligrams a day or even 50 milligrams a day. For doing that on a daily amount, you could be paying for 50 milligrams a day between $500 and $2,500 a year. And for 500 milligrams a day for edibles, that could be between $5,000 and $25,000 a year.
It's a big difference.
And what a lot of people don't realize is a 500 milligram edible for a lot of people, especially new consumers, that's insane. Like that's a large amount. But there are shows that you can watch where there's a show on Hulu called Weedakit, and the first episode they have I think she was a 7-year-old girl, cancer patient, and she's taking like 1,000 milligrams in the morning. Mm-hmm. Even 100 milligrams of THC, they think that they're just out of their mind, gone, like they're just out of this world. They see it the same as like if they were to take a really high dosage of opiates and then like hang out with their family. Like it seems super stigmatized. And when you're at that point of needing pain management, like you kind of don't have the option to not like be on opiates around your family. That's just what it is. But with cannabis, 100 milligrams of THC, even 1,000 milligrams of THC, you can learn to manage it and not have it be this like mentally overstimulating thing. The thing in cannabis that creates that is THC activates neurons in the brain. And when that happens, it appears as like many different thoughts. Like people can start going into rabbit holes of thought, or they can hyper focus on a single thought and not really effectively manage those thoughts because there's so much coming in at the same time. But once you're used to it, you kind of just realize the various thoughts that pass by and you learn to pick up onto the thoughts that you want to. But until you recognize that that's what's going on, it feels like I don't know what to do. Like I'm high, I am not functioning. But the 7-year-old girl who's taking 1,000 milligrams regularly in the show, she's talking and like kind of as a lesson to the world of like, I'm fine, I'm going to die. She's stage 4, like she's familiar with the process, and they do a great job in the medical industry of really like educating those kinds of things. But the reality is, as far as like medication options, is that cannabis can be an option for helping reduce certain tumors, but also even just to provide pain management alone is kind of the main thing that those people are looking for a lot of times. When I first started imagining the cannabis industry, I was thinking that it was more just like casual consumers were the majority of the market. And then I realized that the people that were actually getting these medical cards are real medical patients with real medications that they're trying to replace. The list of people who deal with pain, eventually it comes back to everyone. Eventually you realize that every single person is a candidate for cannabis because every single person will or should expect to experience pain and deterioration throughout their life. And if they're not prepared for high dosages of cannabis, then when those times come that they will be facing pain or deterioration, cannabis is something that is almost like a learned skill that is extremely helpful to learn. But the list of like qualifying conditions in Utah, you've got persistent nausea, Crohn's disease, epilepsy, traumatic PTSD, HIV, AIDS, cancer, autism, Alzheimer's, MS, ALS, rare conditions or diseases, terminal illnesses, or hospice care, persistent or debilitating muscle spasms, and also chronic pain, which would kind of cover like daily back pain, or if somebody's had like a any kind of surgery or any car accident situation where they're having now lifelong or even short-term, long-term pains. Cannabis is something that in Utah you can get a prescription for it, and you can go into their pharmacies and pay their prices for their cannabis.
Yeah, Dave, you make some really interesting points on this with the list of symptoms that it's good for treating, which some of those are just internal digestive stuff. A lot of those are pain and or chronic conditions where we're just trying to keep a patient comfortable while they're slowly dying in pain, or they're deteriorating, like ALS and MS you're talking about, where there's just a deteriorating neurological condition, but they can actually find some pain relief. And I just want to address the safety of this, what you're addressing here with what it's good for. You also talk about some other things. PTSD is a big one. To help somebody with PTSD or stress, fantastic. Finding the right coaching to get the right dosing, I think that's an important part. But opening up their mind to go, hey, I can try something different. And I would encourage people to wash away that stigma and learn what David's teaching here, because it's a very safe product to use as long as you're getting it from a good, healthy source, right? I mean, I'm sure there's sources out there that maybe you got to get a good, clean source. But I just want to put into perspective the safety on this. So with our legal drug dealers, the medical model, and I don't mean that in a derogatory way, but that's kind of what Big Pharma has created, is a group of professionals that are licensed to push their products, which are drugs. We have over 250,000 people a year in America alone that die from the right prescription for the right diagnosis. We have about 20,000 a year that die from aspirin, which is over the counter. And then we have 15,000 a year that die from street drugs, which marijuana to me still falls outside of this. It's somewhere in the in-between, because it's not something harmful like crack cocaine or something. People don't die from marijuana overdose like they do from aspirin or opioids. I would like to address that on some of the safety of cannabis to get the results that we're after, to try to find some relief from our pain or digestive. And how dangerous is it? I don't think it is, from what I've studied. What do you think?
So as far as the dangers of it, I look at cannabis as something that is medically beneficial, even if people are only using it recreationally. The reason I say that is I use Joe Rogan ultimately as kind of a teacher on this to me. He's someone who smokes regularly. He also drinks, but his smoking, he has incorporated into a regular routine of fitness. And when I started to do that with my jujitsu, for one, I started to realize that I had benefits within my jujitsu training that I wasn't having without cannabis, but also just the reduced inflammation benefit of cannabis is something that for anybody going to the gym, that if you're going to the gym, ripping your muscle fibers apart, if you're lifting heavy weights and you're coming home and your muscles are not repairing as much as they can, then by the time you go into your next workout session, you're not going to have the same level of recovery compared to if you were to, say, take some THC, CBD before bed, and then all night long you're having deeper recovery. So when you wake up in the morning the next day, you are feeling better than if you would have skipped on your THC or CBD dosing the night before.
That's a fantastic example, and I love how you brought that up and how you pointed out inflammation. And what it's doing is helping with inflammation through the night so that you recover better. What most people don't realize is inflammation is the cause of all pain, almost all pain, and degeneration. So if we can take an anti-inflammatory product that helps us recover faster, I mean, that just seems like a no-brainer especially if there's no side effects. So how do you take cannabis without side effects of altering your mental faculties, but still getting the benefit of pain relief or anti-inflammation or those kind of things? How do we do that?
Yeah, so ways to incorporate cannabis without the psychoactive activity is cut out the THC. Basically, you cut out the THC, and there are still over 300 different compounds within cannabis that you can get books that go into more detail on specific terpenes or specific flavonoids or specific cannabinoids that can be used for all kinds of different specific treatments for specific cannabinoids. But the main thing is when you cut out THC, the main cannabinoids on the market become CBG, CBN, and CBD. And as long as those don't have THC mixed in with them, then you'll have non-psychoactive effects. Another good way to kind of spin that is if you take, for a new user of THC, 50 milligrams or even 10 milligrams might seem unmanageable. But for CBD, CBG, CBN, you could take 1,000 milligrams and not notice a difference. Someone might notice a difference if they have like other issues going on, say like gastrointestinal issue, and they take CBG 1,000 milligrams. They're like, wow, I feel a lot better now. Like this isn't normal for me. Where somebody who's already healthy and feeling great might take 1,000 milligrams of CBG and then go, I didn't feel anything.
It's fascinating the broad spectrum that the cannabis brings to the table. It's not something like, here, take your vitamin C. Here's a couple things that's good for us. There's different components of it that are active ingredients, and so you need to find out the right balance. So there's some education that needs to take place from somebody who's skilled in this. But if I'm understanding right, our medical professionals, when we go to them with a problem, they don't have the knowledge about CBD to even offer it so the patient can consider this before the other medical things like you mentioned earlier. So then they go in there, it's like, well, cannabis isn't on the table because my doctor doesn't know anything about it, or which we'll get into here in a second, or I have religious concerns because of stigma, I don't want to do it. So that's off the table. So I'm only going to go with the legal drugs that Big Pharma makes, even though they have all kinds of side effects and deterioration, causing problems. How do we help educate the doctors? This is the sad thing, is in America and New Zealand, we're the only two countries on the planet where Big Pharma can market to us, the end user, rather than educating the doctors, and the doctors are our interface. In America now, we go to the doctor and go, oh, I saw this commercial and I have these symptoms, so I need the purple pill. And now we tell the doctor what we want rather than whatever. But even if somebody comes in and says, hey, I'm learning some stuff about cannabis, doc, help me make the right decision on dosage and stuff of cannabis so I don't have to take all these other drugs that are hurting me. How do we educate the doctors to know how to do that?
It's not a matter of educating the doctors, because the doctors are working within very well calculated and thought out, this is what we do if this happens, this is what we do if this happens, and they have like
flowcharts,
books and guides that tell them exactly what to recommend and what they're going to do. Otherwise, they're going to lose their license, and they went to medical school for nothing, and now they're back to like refiguring out life again. And it's a lot of them to be putting all of their schooling and all of their hard work to just like suggest cannabis to someone when they're not allowed to. Luckily, in states that do have medical cannabis, doctors and advanced nurse practitioners can get certified. I believe it's like a 4-hour class with the state, and the state will kind of educate them on how they can recommend cannabis. Cannabis can be rescheduled out of a Schedule 1 drug on the federal level, then that opens it up to cannabis recommendations, and cannabis can actually be integrated into the medical system. And so now when they have all of their list of medications that they're recommending, cannabis can actually be in that list, and they can like let patients know, hey, like these are all of your pain management options. You've got your generic version, you've got the name brand version, or you could also do cannabis, and I'm not going to lose my license. I don't know if the doctors will have like their own like THC brands. Probably in the future, I would imagine that the pricing of cannabis really kind of becomes the like what is the future going to be on that front. And I mentioned earlier the pricing of cannabis, say for 50 milligrams a day, could be between $500 and $2,500 a year, which a lot of people might not think that's a lot of money. That's, for some people, like that's an extra car payment a year. And patients who don't have medical insurance that are covering these things, it becomes like an impossible thing for them to go and buy it legally, which also what drives people into the criminalized markets, is because they're able to actually afford more cannabis for their medical or recreational needs. But then on like the higher end side of things, where 500 milligrams, which would be about maybe a quarter of a joint or half a joint, could cost somebody between $5,000 and $25,000 a year. If they're trying to go like the edible route, it'll probably be closer to like that $25,000 a year. And for half a joint or a quarter of a joint worth of consumption, for some problems, that's not even enough. So for 500 milligrams a day, somebody might want 2,000 milligrams throughout their day. They might need a full joint in the morning and then a full joint at night, or even like multiple joints throughout their day. And joints, you could just say like 1 gram, which could also be vaporized, and that would be better inhalation into the lungs. The difference between burning cannabis and vaporizing cannabis is you have the temperature difference, where you've got 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit for burning material. So whether it's a bong, a joint, both of those are going to be burning, where with a vaporizer, you can vaporize at a much lower temperature, say 500 degrees. And so the air coming in is already going to be half the temperature, and you're also getting a more complete plant profile, because the terpenes at the lower temperature, you actually have more of that aroma and those other effects that come along. It's kind of like essential oils, where having the oils mixed in with other consumptions can be beneficial. Same thing for cannabis. You don't want to waste those terpenes and things through the burning process, because when you burn it, you kind of get more of the burnt flavor, the burnt smells, where if you're vaporizing it, you're really getting the full experience that that plant has to offer. You might notice some of the more piney flavors. You might notice some of the more fruity flavors, some of the more gassy flavors. And for a long time, those terms were kind of used as like criminalized selling points for like how you describe the hype of your strain. But the more they've dug into those little like flavors and things, they've noticed that there is actual correlation to like these different terpenes do have specific benefits that they offer when they are preserved. So like myrcene, pinene, limonene, all of these different terpenes do have benefits that partner well with the cannabinoid benefits, and they help the THC, the CBD mesh with the body a little bit better. It's all just kind of in theory, because people are only allowed to educate cannabis how, depending on what their field tells them they're allowed to educate.
You hit some stuff on the right on the head earlier. That some doctors, they'll lose their license if they're talking about this. If for the listeners that haven't paid attention, especially during this COVID stuff and laws passed in California, doctors can't even talk about COVID off the narrative to even make suggestions of vitamin D and quinine and different things that are natural healthy things, or they can lose their license. I'm sure doctors are suggesting cannabis versus the pharmaceutical stuff, which obviously they make money pushing pharmaceutical stuff, prescriptions too. It's tracked. Oh, this doctor prescribed this. He or she gets a percentage for prescribing that. So not only is it making money, but there's these flow charts. If this, then that. If this, then that for the patient that the doctors have to follow, or they literally lose their license. And it's not just this area. We talked about COVID. We're talking about cannabis. We're talking about cancer. If a medical doctor prescribes anything other than chemotherapy and radiation for cancer in America, they can lose their license. So that's why all these great natural alternatives that are out there, including using cannabis to help with the pain while you're dealing with cancer, they just don't get mentioned. So people they just have to find ways to learn about these things on their own. So thank you again for writing the book and educating us today. What's the most cost-effective way for people to be able to utilize cannabis if that's the route they want to take?
When it comes to cost, I used to really look at what is best for patients. Is it the medical industry? Is it the recreational industry? What is it that is going to allow patients to consume enough for their needs? And when you look at the medical prices and the recreational prices, they're pretty close to each other. Some medical industries can have kind of ways of working with patients where they get reduced prices, but ultimately insurance isn't covering it. Insurance isn't allowed to cover it. So patients are kind of faced with the same scenario of cannabis is extremely expensive. It's one of the most expensive crops that we grow and sell. You could use tobacco as a comparable thing of you can buy a carton of, or you can buy a pack of cigarettes for what, I don't even know, $5-10. What, I have no idea how much they cost, but for let's say one box of cigarettes versus one box of cannabis could be $25 for kind of some more lower quality cannabis, to if you're buying regular high grade top shelf cannabis, it could be upwards of $100 for a half ounce. So when you're comparing your box of cigarettes of joints versus tobacco, you're looking at $5-10 to $25 to $100. As far as comparing the two, there's far more benefits that can be realized from the THC side and the cannabis side compared to what we already know about tobacco. Another element of the price is the home growing. In my book, I try to mention it a few times, but home growing is something that I believe every human should have a natural right to. And I believe that every single human should have a universal right to home growing. I think that home growing is the solution, ensuring that everyone has access to this wellness. As far as the pricing of what it costs to produce cannabis, if you cut out all of the distribution and all of the you could say transportation of cannabis, you have the transportation, you have all of the overhead of cannabis companies having dispensaries, and they have all of their taxation that they pay, and they have all of their employees that they pay. Where if you just grow a cannabis plant in your backyard, if you already have a garden, it's really easy to just throw extra seeds and you just have a new plant variety. It's if you're growing 5 different kinds of tomatoes, growing one more extra tomato plant is gonna not be any extra work.
It seems so logical and such an affordable way to do something. I just don't understand why the laws, other than big pharma has more lobbyists than we even have congressmen and senators, unless they're threatened by it, I don't see any reason why we wouldn't have that legal, that we could just grow in our garden what we want to grow in our garden.
They don't understand it either. People in the industry don't understand home growing as an option because they see it as like, you can't trust the public to grow clean medicine from themselves. Like they're going to have contaminants in their garden, and then you basically push them to garden it themselves. So you're now responsible for them essentially poisoning themselves. But at some point, you have to allow people to protect themselves and to access this plant themselves. There are plenty of ways that people can learn to grow safely, that like people can learn to garden organically, and people are already like doing this in a lot of ways. And if one person in a neighborhood knows how to do it, they can make it accessible to everyone in their neighborhood. Like my family's got over 100 people at this point, and if one person could just learn how to grow, then they would be able to easily provide for the entire family with just a couple plants a year, compared to if everybody in the family just goes to recreational or medical cannabis. My family could end up spending tens of thousands of dollars compared to if I just did a row of cannabis in my backyard. People don't look at cannabis consumption from the financial perspective because I think most people are not as connected to how finance works as they think. Like finance is oddly abstract, I think, in a lot of people's lives, whether by the time they mix in like credit card debt or financial debt, good debt versus bad debt, school debt versus house debt. Like there's a lot of different components of financials that people aren't always looking at their end goal of retirement, or looking at like how much money they're going to have when something comes up that they're going to need more financing. And the thing that is best for everyone financially is home growing. And I have some ideas for a term that I developed in the book, which is universal home growing. And that's actually the name of my website. Right now it's universalhomegrowing.com. But right now the website is just a link to the Amazon page to go and buy the book. It's in the future, I would like universal home growing to be kind of a more known term that in the industry is kind of more of a focus of this is how we educate cannabis. It's not about educating what all the benefits are and what the good strains are that we have. It's about teaching patients grow a good strain at home and access it and consume it in a better manner than if you were to just like pick it off and start lighting it on fire and smoking it. You could extract it, get it into a more concentrated form, and then inhale it, and that's going to be better for you. Another good way of like looking at pricing, Morocco. You can go into the grocery store in Morocco, buy a brick of hash, which is concentrated THC. Like it looks like a thing, like a giant piece of butter, but it's just straight THC hash. $7. So it would be like buying like a full bottle of ibuprofen for $7, and it's super potent THC. You break off a little chunk of it and put it in your food, and you have high THC if that's what you're needing. But here in America, that little brick of hash is not $7. It would be like hundreds or thousands of dollars.
We make it the forbidden fruit because there's other industries that are pushing it out of the norm. That's the shame. Yeah. All right, well, that's some really good information for the public. I just want to make sure the public understands that it's much safer than people think. I want us to finish on some stigma and overcoming the stigma and the religion stuff, but I think I do want to sum up the safety. People think, oh, it might not be safe. It's a street drug. It's not. That is not what cannabis is at all. It's just been labeled that way. And if I could compare it to something in the consumption products, coconut oil. Coconut oil is like a superfood. And yet for 20 years, it was pushed aside. It's so unhealthy for you. It's got these medium chain fatty acids. And the other oil companies in the industry slandered it to promote their products. And to me, it seems like cannabis has been in that same boat for 40, 50, 60 years, 70 years, whatever, because big pharma can't capitalize and make money on it. The best way to do it is to grow it at home, which then nobody's profiting from it. And maybe it's taking profits from somebody else. And so it's been mislabeled, misstigmatized for far too long. And I think that's the beautiful part of your book and this kind of teaching and sharing with the community is there's a product here that you can grow yourself, which we should have the freedom to do that, or you can buy it and spend more in other ways to use it. But you just need to learn what it's good for. Use it for the right uses, find out affordable ways to use it properly, and understand that it's safe. And again, I'm just going to compare again. When we look at 250,000 deaths per year for the right prescription for the right drug, 20,000 for aspirin, 15,000 for street drugs, nobody dies from marijuana use. And I also have to throw in there, we've had over 35,000 deaths from vaccines since COVID. And we don't talk about that in the news, but that's a really scary fact that Senator Johnson has pointed out right to the public, but yet it just keeps getting hushed. We're just ignoring these dangers over here when there's products on the other side of the fence that are so good for us, if we can just stop judging them and stigmatizing them. So let's talk about some of the stigmas that are out there and where they came from, or if they're religious based, how we can overcome those and be free thinkers for ourselves without the guilt and shame that maybe our religion's putting on us to go, look, this is a medicine for me. It shouldn't be stigmatized by religion. How do I stand in faith and confidence and utilize something that's good for me like this?
As far as stigmas go, I would say smoking is kind of like the main stigma, that people really don't want to inhale anything into their lungs. They think that's kind of like majorly invasive. Smoking in the normal sense, where people are used to smoking a quarter a joint a day, like a lot of people can't even finish a full joint in a day. Like it takes quite a bit to build up to be able to finish a whole joint in a day. Even at one joint a day, the amount of pressure on the lungs, you could say, the amount of damage happening in the lungs is, for one, not going to be comparable to somebody who's smoking a whole pack of cigarettes in a day. But one joint a day of inhalation, people could also look at versus somebody who's not smoking at all. Unless the person who's not smoking at all is incorporating some other kind of breathing exercise into their day, they could be having less inhalation activity in their day of oxygen compared to somebody who smokes, even just one joint a day. Because with that smoking, you might take a deeper breath and hold it longer than most people do in their year. Like, especially if people aren't working out and they're not getting any kind of like breathing in their day, just incorporating smoking on a small level is a good introduction to, oh yeah, like I need to breathe. And it's good for me to breathe deep, and it's good for people to learn the process of breathing and to recognize that this thing that can be used for inhalation of beneficial substances is also something to keep in mind for just regular oxygen inhalation, which also has its own list of benefits. So they should be protecting their lungs by doing breathing exercises and actually building the strength in their lungs to be able to handle deep breaths and to be able to take in more oxygen. Another good example of this would be people who play wind instruments,
Hmm.
saxophone, didgeridoo, trumpet, whatever. Those people work on their lungs. They breathe, they have breathing exercises before they play, and over years they can really build that strength in their lungs. So that's one stigma I would say, is just smoking is not as bad as it seems. And by the time you are consuming a large amount of cannabis by smoking, you're usually, not usually, by that point, it becomes like uncomfortable to have that much smoke going through your lungs anyway, that
Hmm.
you tend to start going towards edibles just because it like gets hard to physically do that. Like you have to like really try to be able to smoke that much.
Gotcha. Well, I have to admit, I had some stigmas with it in the beginning, mostly because the smell from the smoke. I don't really care for the smell. But now that once I started learning all these benefits, and especially with my first wife struggling with cancer and the pain that she had and the comfort and peace that she had utilizing it, and realizing, oh, there are more ways to utilize cannabis besides just smoking it from a bong or a joint or something. So have those helped break up some of the stigma by having multiple ways of using it now?
I graduated in 2010 in high school, and by that time, extraction was getting better, but it was still like I feel like when I whenever I did see like dab or concentrate and people like loading it into a bong and hitting it, like it almost seemed like sketchier than flour. Like flour was the safe option, and then if somebody had oil, it was like, oh, that oil could have been extracted with dangerous chemicals, and
Mm-hmm.
that could also be within the oil. But now that oil has become so accessible, now that they have like the vape cartridges where people can have that high quality concentrated oil, and just be able to take a quick rip from that, that's an easy way to inhale THC with less of a process than like learning to grind up the flour and roll a joint or use a glass piece and cleaning the glass piece. Like there's a whole like kind of ritual that goes along with like inhaling flour.
Mm-hmm.
And there is a similar thing with the oil if you're using like a dab rig or like a bong to consume the oil. But the cartridges have really simplified the process of you don't need to clean anything. It is as quick as screwing it onto a battery, and then like you're dosed. Like there's
Mm-hmm.
not a whole lot that goes into like needing to prepare dosages or like figure out like what the right amount is for you. You don't have to be worried about overdoses. Having clean options for extractions has been the main thing in the industry that's really kind of cleaned things up in the perception of like there are better ways to consume this plant than just flour. But people also have to remember that just flour is also beneficial too. It's still better than the list of alternatives that people are probably going to be facing. And if people are consuming sugar, that alone is like worse than flour.
Absolutely. Matter of fact, if the FDA were to just discover sugar today, this study came out just, I don't know, 4 years ago. They said it's so addictive in nature that it wouldn't pass the FDA if it wasn't already grandfathered in from decades ago. So sugar's bad. And I think that's interesting. And I love that approach that you're bringing in, the point you're trying to make in your book on the chapters on the religious stigma. I started working on a book years ago called The Science and Religion of Nutrition that was addressing, well, why do Muslims not eat pork? And not drink alcohol? Why do Jewish people also not eat pork? And why does this Mormon, because you were talking about your book started for Utah, does the Mormon faith have this word of wisdom that they follow that's 170 years old, and people can be 400 pounds and diabetic drinking 6 Diet Pepsis a day, but yet they would like, oh my gosh, I couldn't dare have cannabis. And there's a point where we need to stop and look at, and I'm not trying to shift anybody's religion. I don't think you are either. We're just trying to help them open their mind of having that personal revelation, of that personal understanding of, hey, sometimes there are things that are good for me that maybe the mass or an old thinking might not recognize, but they're not living in my shoes. They're not dealing with my aches and pains. They're not dealing with my digestive problems or my cancer or my this. What do I need, and where can I be comfortable in my own skin? Educating myself about something like cannabis and deciding for myself where and how much to use, and feel okay with that. And I love that you're trying to bring that to people's attention to like, don't miss out on something that could help you because of a fear of something, some older programming. Look into some new thinking, or at least have open-minded. Did I address that properly for what you're trying to point out in the book?
In the world, I think that there's a lot of hesitation of each other when it comes to organized religions and the cannabis industry. And I think that the cannabis industry or the cannabis community, or everybody who's figured out that cannabis is good for them, there is a level of like distrust of organized religions and people who think that they do have the right to tell people that they cannot consume cannabis. And the main point that I wanted to make is that people should have the right to not consume cannabis themselves. And I think that they should get the option to believe in a religion that chooses to not consume cannabis. But the moment any religion tries to tell people that they cannot consume cannabis, they are infringing on natural rights. Once everybody understands cannabis correctly, it's pretty easy to see what we've been missing out on.
If I'm understanding right, because I don't want to put words in your mouth, and so maybe I summed up a little bit different than you just did right there, but you're pointing out that organized religions, the religion, not a problem, but when they start overstepping the bounds and maybe affecting legislature to push down cannabis, that, oh, you can't have this if you're in our religion, that's where it's harmful. And I would just use the same example, like if they said, oh, well, you can't use fish oil because that's harmful, and that's against in our religion, we think that fish oil is harmful, so you can't have it and still be in our religion. It's kind of where to me, it seems like they're labeling like and I don't know if I'm using a bad example or not.
The difficult part is it's on a micro level, it's on like a local level, and it's within like your neighborhood. It's at the schools of like how children affect each other and teach each other what their beliefs are. But then there's the macro level where historically organized religions have introduced cannabis laws to other countries and have literally enslaved other countries by cutting them off from cannabis and basically getting rid of their free market of the most beneficial substance they could be consuming. Throughout the history of, like, if you just research like cannabis criminalization laws on Wikipedia, it will literally show like the first time cannabis was made illegal was like a couple hundred years ago. And then it'll show like all of the different countries that got affected afterwards. And when you follow that line, it basically comes back to like Roman Catholics taking over the world and going into different regions and establishing their dominance, getting rid of existing religions, and kind of putting their name on the country of like the reason why you're good is because we came in and fixed everything. The way they did that is they didn't fix everything. They came in, started taking all of their money, and then they started like helping build other things for them. They could have done it themselves. And we're actually learning this today in the world, that if a country becomes a free market, they're able to develop faster than if they are not a free market and say just their government's taking in their money. Then the government is either spending that in completely other directions, which is not going back into their country, or they're just keeping it and nobody's benefiting from it. So
Okay.
they are learning today, especially in like other like less developed countries, that if they just allow, like if they reduce taxes significantly, then those people are able to like start investing in their properties and start investing in their communities in ways that like I think they use Singapore as an example of, like, not too long ago Singapore was not doing that well. They had some
Mhm.
tax changes and then they exploded. Like,
Right. Right. It's a good example. Well, in closing, is there any fine points that you'd like to wrap up with?
fine points, I would just say cannabis is something that people should always be looking at, and they should be looking to develop their comfortability in cannabis way before they ever need cannabis. And I would also suggest that people look into home growing. And I think that the industry needs more complete cannabis education for each other and also for new consumers. And I do think that my book could be an option for helping the industry better understand itself and hopefully give us a better understanding of cannabis as a whole in the world, what it means for us, and how we can do that more effectively so that people are not putting too much hypothetical what ifs of what the harms and dangers are of cannabis, and start looking at like what it's actually helping with, and realizing that that's the main thing that cannabis is.
Yep. Cannabis has huge benefits for humanity if we would just get out of our own way and let ourselves not feel guilty about it, not have laws passed against it, and figure out ways to cost effectively obtain it as a consumer, whether that's homegrown or otherwise, I guess is where we're going with that, right?
Yep.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, thanks for your time today.